Every single morning right now, there's a new image circulating online. Another Russian oil refinery engulfed in flames, another fuel depot gone, another piece of Vladimir Putin's war machine turned to smoke and rubble. This isn't happening on some far-off battlefield. It's happening deep inside Russia. And it's happening so often, so consistently, that Putin himself, a man who has spent 26 years never admitting weakness, never admitting fault, has quietly started acknowledging that things aren't going well. That single admission tells you everything you need to know. Today, we're breaking down why Putin is cornered, why his economy is being systematically dismantled, why his next move might be the most dangerous decision of his presidency, and why that decision could either save him or get him killed. The man who can't admit defeat. Let's start with something basic about how Putin operates. In more than 2 decades in power, this is not a man who apologizes. He doesn't concede points. He doesn't admit that a plan has failed. That's not just a personality quirk, it's a survival strategy. In an authoritarian system built entirely around the image of a strong, infallible leader, showing weakness isn't just embarrassing, it's dangerous. So when Putin recently acknowledged, even in a roundabout way, that Russia is facing real difficulties in Ukraine, that's not a small thing. That's a crack in the armor. Because everyone watching already knew it. You didn't need Putin to confirm it. The evidence has been visible for months. But the fact that he said it out loud means the pressure has become too obvious to paper over. And where is that pressure coming from? Not primarily from the front lines, where the war has ground into a bloody stalemate for years. It's coming from somewhere Putin never expected to be vulnerable. Deep inside Russian territory, far from Ukrainian soil, at the refineries and terminals that keep Russia's entire war economy running. Ukraine has quietly built one of the most effective long-range drone campaigns of the entire war. Oil refineries are being hit one after another. Logistics hubs tied to the occupation of Crimea have been destroyed. Export terminals on the Baltic coast have been struck. This is a slow-motion economic strangulation, and there is no way for Putin to spin it, hide it, or wave it away. His country's economic capacity is being dismantled piece by piece, and everybody, Russians included, can see the flames. This doesn't mean Russia is collapsing tomorrow. It doesn't mean Putin is about to sign a peace deal. But it means he has a genuine problem, one that's compounding by the week, and the way dictators typically respond to compounding problems is not with de-escalation, it's with escalation. Section 2. What escalation could look like. So what happens next? If Putin can't fix this economic bleeding through negotiation, and he won't fix it through withdrawal, the most likely path is doubling down. There are 2 forms this escalation could realistically take. First, intensified bombing campaigns against Ukrainian cities. If Putin can't stop the drones hitting his refineries, he may try to inflict enough pain on Ukrainian civilians that it forces some kind of political or psychological capitulation, or at least gives him something to show his own population as progress. Expect more missile barrages, more strikes aimed not at military targets, but at the fabric of civilian life. Apartment blocks, power grids, hospitals. Second, and far more consequential domestically, a general mobilization. This is the one to really pay attention to, because it changes everything about how this war is experienced inside Russia itself. Here's why. For most of this war, Putin has avoided touching the broader Russian population. His method of recruitment has been almost entirely transactional, offering enormous signing bonuses, sometimes worth years of an ordinary salary, to poor and often rural Russians willing to go fight. It's brutal, but it's been effective, because it targeted people with the least social and political power to push back. Most of those men are now dead. But crucially, their deaths never touched Moscow, St. Petersburg, or the Russian middle class in any meaningful way. That was by design. Putin has always understood that as long as the war stays invisible to the people who actually have the power to organize against him, he's safe. But that system is running out of road. There are 2 reasons for that. The money to keep offering massive bonuses is drying up, and the pool of people desperate enough to take that bait has been largely exhausted. Meanwhile, the front line still needs bodies. If money can no longer solve that problem, the only remaining tool is force. A broad, compulsory draft that reaches into households that have, until now, felt completely insulated from this war. That is an entirely different political animal. A targeted, voluntary recruitment drive among the poor doesn't threaten a regime. A mass conscription that reaches into the middle class, into cities, into families with connections and resources and voices. That's the kind of thing that creates real anger, real resistance, and real risk. Section 3. The repression machine spins. Putin knows this, and that's why, even before any formal mass mobilization has been announced, we're already watching the early architecture of repression being built. Look at what's already happening. Telegram, the primary messaging app that most Russians rely on to communicate and, crucially, to organize and gossip about politics, has faced increasing restrictions. Mobile internet has been shut down in Moscow and St. Petersburg, the 2 cities where unrest would matter most, where the political and economic elite actually live. These aren't random bureaucratic decisions. They're preemptive moves by a leader who understands that the thing most likely to end his rule isn't a foreign army, it's his own population talking to each other and coordinating. If a genuine general conscription is announced, expect this repression to intensify sharply. One of the most probable moves would be an effective closure of the borders, specifically targeting young men of fighting age, cutting off the escape valve that hundreds of thousands of Russians have already used since the war began. Because if you're going to force people into a war they don't want to fight, you also have to make sure they can't simply leave the country before you can conscript them. This is the core tension Putin now has to manage. On one side, his military desperately needs more soldiers, and money alone can no longer supply them. On the other side, the only remaining way to get those soldiers, forced conscription, is the single policy most likely to generate the kind of broad, cross-class anger that could threaten his grip on power. He is boxed in from both directions, and every option in front of him carries risk. Section 4. Will Russians rise up? Naturally, this raises the question everyone wants answered. Is this the beginning of the end for Putin? Could this actually trigger an uprising? Here's an honest answer. Nobody actually knows, and that includes Putin himself. History is full of examples where enormous sudden uprisings were triggered by something almost nobody could have predicted. The Arab Spring is the classic case. It wasn't sparked by a coordinated opposition movement or a foreign intervention. It began with a single fruit vendor in Tunisia who set himself on fire in protest after being humiliated by local officials. That one act of desperation cascaded into the collapse of multiple governments across an entire region. Nobody planned for that. Nobody could have predicted the timing or the trigger. That's the uncomfortable truth about authoritarian collapse. It's almost never predictable in advance, even by the people closest to the situation. Pressure can build for years without visibly cracking, and then a single, seemingly minor event tips everything over. Equally, pressure can build for years and simply not tip over. Populations can absorb an extraordinary amount of hardship, especially when the state controls the information they receive and punishes dissent brutally and visibly. And that second scenario, pressure building without triggering collapse, is actually the more statistically likely outcome here, at least in the near term. Putin has been remarkably effective at holding on to power for over 2.5 decades through wars, economic crises, and open challenges to his authority. That track record matters. Consider what happened with Yevgeny Prigozhin and the Wagner mutiny. For a brief, tense period in 2023, it looked like Putin's grip on power might actually be slipping, an armed column of mercenaries marching toward Moscow with apparently minimal resistance. And yet, within months, Prigozhin was dead in a plane crash that nobody seriously believes was an accident. What's especially telling is how public that death was made. The Kremlin didn't try to quietly dispose of the situation. They made sure the world saw footage of the wreckage, saw the plane falling from the sky. That wasn't incompetence. That was a message, delivered with mafia-style precision. If you challenge this system, this is what happens to you, and everyone will know it happened. That kind of theater is remarkably effective at suppressing future challenges. It doesn't eliminate the underlying anger simmering in Russian society, but it makes the personal cost of acting on that anger extremely visible and extremely high. And that's exactly the calculation most people make when they're weighing whether to protest, organize, or resist. Not just, am I angry, but what happens to me and my family if I act on that anger? So the most probable outcome, at least for now, isn't a dramatic uprising. It's something quieter and grimmer. Life inside Russia getting steadily worse, more repression, more economic strain, more grief pouring into ordinary households, while most people remain angry but largely inactive, watching, waiting, calculating the risk of doing anything about it. Section 5. Russia's size. Once an advantage, now a liability. There's an irony sitting at the center of Russia's current predicament, and it has to do with the country's sheer size. For centuries, Russia's massive territory has functioned as one of its greatest strategic assets. It's genuinely difficult to conquer a country that large. Historically, invading armies, including Napoleon's and Hitler's, have been swallowed up trying to control that much land, stretched thin across brutal distances and unforgiving terrain. But that same enormous landmass, which made Russia so hard to invade, is now working against it in a completely different kind of war. A war fought not with advancing armies, but with long-range drones. A country that large has an enormous number of economic assets spread across it. Refineries, pipelines, fuel depots, export terminals, rail junctions, all of that infrastructure needs to be defended, and defending everything, everywhere, all the time is essentially impossible. Ukraine has exploited this reality with real skill. Every time Ukrainian drones strike a target deep inside Russia, Putin's instinct is to reinforce air defenses around the targets that matter most to him personally. Above all, Moscow, where his own safety is the priority. But every air defense system moved to protect the capital is one that's no longer protecting a refinery in some other region. The map of Russia is simply too vast to cover completely, and the more Putin concentrates protection around himself, the more exposed everything else becomes. The result is what we're seeing play out in real time, a seemingly endless string of successful strikes on economic targets month after month because Russia's defensive capacity fundamentally cannot keep pace with the size of the territory it needs to protect. Russia's air defenses have struggled to adapt, and in the meantime, the economic damage keeps compounding. Section 6. A superpower in name only. This gets at something bigger about Russia's actual standing in the world right now. For decades, Russia's claim to superpower status rested almost entirely on its military. Its nuclear arsenal, its vast conventional forces, its historical reputation for toughness and resilience. But a military that is visibly struggling, bleeding manpower, unable to defend its own economic infrastructure, forced into increasingly desperate recruitment tactics, undercuts the entire foundation of that reputation. And when you strip away the military mystique, what's actually left? Economically, Russia isn't nearly as large as its geopolitical posture would suggest. Its overall economy is smaller than Italy's, it's smaller than the state of New York's. That comparison is genuinely jarring when you sit with it. A country that spans 11 time zones, that holds the largest nuclear arsenal on the planet, that has spent years projecting itself as one of the handful of nations capable of reshaping global order, its actual economic output is comparable to a single US state. Strip away the military dimension, and Russia's ability to project power in the world shrinks dramatically. That's the box Putin has built for himself. Enormous ambition, shrinking means. Section 7. Crimea. Symbol versus strategy. Nowhere is that tension between symbolism and reality clearer than in Crimea. Back in 2014, the annexation of Crimea wasn't primarily a strategic military necessity. It was a political performance, engineered to boost Putin's domestic standing. It worked. The operation was largely bloodless, and it triggered a genuine wave of nationalist pride across Russia. Putin's approval numbers spiked. Crimea became, and has remained, a powerful symbol of Russian strength and resurgence, proof in the eyes of many Russians that their country could reclaim what it saw as historically its own. Now, more than a decade later, that same symbol has become a target. Ukraine has increasingly focused on economically isolating the peninsula, hitting the fuel supplies, the energy infrastructure, the water access that Crimea depends on to function day to day. The logic is straightforward. Make it a difficult, uncomfortable place to live, and over time, people leave. And if the population that gives Crimea its practical value starts hollowing out, holding on to it becomes a much harder, much more expensive proposition. But it's important to draw a clear distinction here. Making Crimea painful and dysfunctional through targeted strikes on fuel and infrastructure is a completely different challenge than physically retaking the peninsula through military force. Ukraine simply doesn't have the scale of military manpower required for that kind of full-scale reconquest, and Russia has spent years heavily fortifying its positions there. So even in a worst-case scenario for Russia, a Crimea that's economically strangled, increasingly depopulated, and barely functional, that doesn't automatically translate into Ukrainian forces marching back in and reclaiming the territory. Symbolically damaged is not the same as strategically lost, and Russia is very unlikely to simply walk away from a place so tightly bound up with Putin's own political mythology. Section 8. Toward an unspoken truce? So where does all of this actually lead? Not most likely to a formal peace agreement. That still looks like a distant, unlikely outcome. Putin's personal political survival is directly tied to continuing this war, for reasons we'll get to in a moment, but there's a more subtle possibility worth watching closely: the emergence of an unspoken, informal arrangement between the two sides. Here's the logic. Ukraine has, through its drone campaign, demonstrated a genuine and growing capacity to inflict real economic pain on Russia. Pain that's difficult to hide, difficult to reverse, and increasingly difficult for Putin to explain away to his own population. That capability creates something Ukraine hasn't had much of throughout this war: leverage. It opens the door to a kind of mutual deterrence, an unofficial line neither side wants to cross. Russia holds back from its most devastating strikes on Ukrainian civilian centers, and in exchange, Ukraine holds back from its most damaging strikes on Russian economic infrastructure. Nobody signs anything, nobody announces it, but both sides start operating according to an implicit understanding that further escalation on either side invites proportional retaliation. This wouldn't end the war. Fighting along the front lines would likely continue much as it has, but it would represent something meaningful, a recognition, on both sides, that mutual restraint might actually serve both sides' interests better than continued escalation. And crucially, it demonstrates something important about the nature of asymmetric warfare in this conflict. You don't necessarily need to defeat an opponent's military to change their strategic calculations. You just need to make continued aggression costly enough that restraint starts to look like the more rational choice. Section 9. Why Putin can never stop. Let's return to the question that sits underneath everything we've discussed today. Why won't Putin simply end this war, given how much damage it's doing to his own country? The answer isn't really about strategy, it's about personal survival. Think about what ending this war would actually mean for Putin. If the fighting stops, Russians would inevitably start asking the questions that propaganda has managed to suppress for years. What did we actually gain from this? Why did we go to war in the first place? And perhaps most dangerously for Putin, who actually started it? Because ultimately, responsibility traces back to one person. A war that has cost well over 1 million young Russian lives, killed or wounded. Another million or more who fled the country rather than fight or live under wartime conditions. An economy hollowed out by sanctions and misallocated resources. A military that has been exposed as far less capable than its reputation suggested. All of that, in the eyes of an increasingly disillusioned public, traces back to one decision made by one man. And in a system like Russia's, there's no soft landing for a leader who loses legitimacy. There's no dignified retirement, no presidential library, no comfortable exit to a quiet life of memoirs and speaking tours. Historically, in Russia, when a leader like this leaves power, the outcomes tend toward two extremes: prison or death. That's the brutal calculation Putin is making every single day. It doesn't matter whether continuing the war is good or bad for Russia as a country. From Putin's own personal self-interested perspective, ending the war is far more dangerous to him than continuing it. So he continues. Not because it's working, not because it's rational for the nation, but because the alternative, for him personally, is almost certainly worse. Section 10. The drone war and what comes next. One final piece of this puzzle worth understanding. This is fundamentally a war being reshaped by technology, and technology doesn't sit still. Right now, Ukraine holds a genuine and significant advantage in long-range drone warfare, both in terms of the technology itself and the operational skill to use it effectively. That advantage is a major reason why Russian oil refineries keep burning and why Russia's economic infrastructure keeps taking hits it can't adequately defend against. But advantages like this rarely last forever in modern warfare. At some point, effective countermeasures will likely emerge. Better detection systems, improved interception technology, more effective air defense networks. That could come from Russia itself, or potentially from other nations that develop and eventually share or sell that technology. When that happens, Ukraine's current edge could shrink substantially. That moment doesn't appear to have arrived yet. Russia, despite the scale of the damage it's absorbing, doesn't currently look like the country most likely to be the one that cracks the problem of stopping these drone strikes at scale. And in the meantime, the pattern we've been discussing throughout this video continues, strike after strike, refinery after refinery, each one adding to the pressure bearing down on Putin's regime. But that technological edge is a countdown clock, not a permanent state of affairs. It's worth watching closely, because when, or if, Russia or its allies do develop effective countermeasures, the entire strategic picture we've laid out today could shift substantially. So here's where that leaves us. Putin is more boxed in than at almost any point since this war began. His economy is being systematically damaged in ways he can't easily counter. His options for replenishing his military are narrowing toward the one option, mass conscription, that carries the greatest domestic political risk. And every tool he has for managing that risk involves tightening the grip of repression around his own population. None of this guarantees his downfall. History, and Putin's own 2.5-decade track record, suggests he's remarkably good at surviving exactly these kinds of pressures. But it does mean that the coming months carry more genuine uncertainty than this war has seen in a long time. Whether that uncertainty resolves into further entrenchment, into an unspoken truce along the economic front, or into something far more volatile inside Russia itself, nobody can say for certain. Not analysts, not Western governments, and as strange as it sounds, probably not even Vladimir Putin himself. If you found this breakdown valuable, make sure to subscribe for more deep dives into the geopolitics shaping this war, and let me know in the comments. Do you think Putin survives this, or is this the beginning of the end? End of script.